The tea was still warm when I heard my son discussing my funeral like it was a scheduling inconvenience. I was standing in the pantry, the heavy pine door slightly ajar, holding a jar of preserved peaches I had canned the previous autumn. In the dining room, Julian's voice carried that distinct, sharp edge he used when he was trying to sound like his father. It was a tone meant for boards and bank managers, but lately he had begun using it on me. "We have to look at the square footage logically, Clara," Julian was saying. His spoon clinked against the porcelain, the gold-rimmed cups that had belonged to my mother. "Mother doesn't use the south wing. It's sitting there, gathering dust, while we're cramped in the north corridor. If we move her to the room over the garage, we can convert her suite into an office. And when the time comes, well, the transition to Cedar Crest will be much easier if she's already accustomed to a smaller space." Clara, his wife, let out a soft, non-committal hum. "And the cost? Cedar Crest isn't cheap, Julian. We're already stretched with the private school tuition for Leo and the country club fees." "The house is the equity," Julian replied, his tone dismissive and easy. "Once she's settled, we sell the property. It's what Father would have wanted. He always said the house was our safety net." I stood very still in the dimness of the pantry. The jar of peaches was cool against my palms. Children rarely notice the floor beneath their feet until it starts to rot, but they are even quicker to forget who laid the boards. Julian was 38. He wore suits that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, drove a German sedan that hummed like a sleeping predator in our gravel driveway, and spoke of assets and leverage with the casual confidence of a man who had never known a cold night. He believed he was the savior of this family. He believed that his presence in this house, the historic stone manor my late husband Arthur and I had bought 40 years ago, was an act of profound charity. After Arthur died 7 years ago, the family business had crumbled, or rather, that was the story Julian told everyone at the funeral. He had stepped in, assumed the mantle, and moved his young family into the manor to take care of his grieving, aging mother. For 7 years, I had watched him play the part of the patriarch. I had cooked their dinners, folded their laundry, washed the mud from Leo's shoes, and quietly retreated to my rooms whenever they hosted dinners for Julian's colleagues. I became the quiet background hum of their lives, the woman who made sure the pantry was stocked and the gardens were weeded, but who was never invited to sit at the head of the table. They treated me like a tenant who had stayed past her lease, a polite burden. I placed the jar of peaches back on the shelf, my movements slow and deliberate. In the pocket of my linen apron, my fingers brushed against the cool, heavy brass of my keyring. Among the small silver keys for the cabinets in the back door was one large, tarnished skeleton key. It was the key to the iron safe in the basement study, the room Julian had locked and designated as his private archive, unaware that I had a duplicate of every key in this house. "Mother!" The pantry door opened wider, and Julian stood there. He had his sleeves rolled up, revealing the heavy gold watch Arthur had given him for his graduation. He looked at me with a mixture of mild irritation and the practiced patience one reserves for a slow-witted child. "There you are," he said, looking at the jar in my hand. "We've been waiting for the tea. Clara needs to leave for her committee meeting in 20 minutes. "I was just getting the peaches, Julian," I said softly. My voice was thin, dry, and entirely devoid of the anger that was beginning to pool in my chest. "Let's leave the canning for another day," he said, reaching out to take the jar from me, his grip slightly too firm. "You shouldn't be reaching for things on the top shelves anyway. If you fall, it's not like we have someone here to watch you 24 hours a day." It was a small comment, a tiny, needle-sharp reminder of my vulnerability. He thought he was planting the seeds of my dependency, preparing me for the small room over the garage, and eventually the sterile corridors of Cedar Crest. "Of course," I murmured, stepping out of the pantry. As I walked into the bright kitchen, Clara did not look up from her phone. She was typing rapidly, her manicured nails clicking against the glass screen. Leo, my grandson, was sitting at the island, coloring a picture with a red crayon. He was the only one who looked at me, giving me a small, timid smile. "Did you find the honey, Grandma?" he asked. "I did, sweetheart," I said, reaching into my apron to pull out the small glass jar I had retrieved earlier. "Don't give him too much sugar, Mother," Clara said, her eyes never leaving her phone. "He has soccer practice at 4, and he gets sluggish if he eats sweets." "It's organic honey, Clara. Just a drop," I said. Julian entered the kitchen, adjusting his collar in the reflection of the microwave door. "By the way, Mother, the accountant is coming by on Thursday. We need to go over the property tax assessment. Since the house is still technically under the estate's name, I'll need you to sign some authorization forms so I can handle the appeal. The county raised our valuation again." "The taxes are high this year?" I asked, setting the teacup down in front of Clara. "Astronomical," Julian sighed, shaking his head. "It's getting harder to justify keeping this place, honestly. But don't worry about it. I'm managing it. Just make sure you're here on Thursday to sign the papers. Don't go wandering off to the garden when he arrives." I looked at my son. I looked at the slight double chin he was developing, the expensive leather shoes he wore, the arrogant tilt of his head. He truly believed he was the one paying the county. He truly believed that the money keeping the lights on, the heaters running, and the taxes paid came from his struggling real estate firm. He did not know about the green leather ledger hidden beneath the floorboards of the basement safe. He did not know that his father had died completely bankrupt, and that the only reason we still had this roof over our heads was because of a quiet, private trust my own father had set up for me decades ago, a trust that Julian had no legal right to and no knowledge of. For 7 years, I had quietly deposited enough money into the joint household account to cover the mortgage and the taxes, letting Julian believe his meager contributions were what saved us. I had let him play the king of the castle because I loved him and because I wanted him to feel strong. But love is a strange thing. When treated with contempt, it doesn't always die. Sometimes it simply turns into a very cold, very clear-eyed clarity. "I will be here on Thursday, Julian," I said, my voice steady. "I won't wander off." He smiled, a patronizing, quick gesture, and tapped my shoulder. "Good. We need to keep things moving. I have a major closing next week, and I can't be distracted by household logistics." He turned to leave, but as he did, his phone rang. He pulled it out, his face instantly tightening as he read the caller ID. He didn't answer it. He pressed the silent button and shoved it back into his pocket, a sudden shadow of anxiety crossing his eyes. I recognized that look. It was the same look Arthur used to get right before the creditors started calling. The house was always loudest right after they left. The front door would slam, the heavy oak vibrating in its frame, and then the gravel would crunch under the tires of Julian's car. For a few minutes, the rooms would retain the frantic, electric energy of their presence, the scent of Clara's expensive perfume lingering in the foyer, the crumbs Leo had dropped on the rug, the lingering vibration of Julian's hurried footsteps. Then the silence would settle. It was a heavy, ancient silence that rose from the floorboards like dust. A man drowning in debt doesn't look for a life raft. He looks for someone to push under so he can stand on their shoulders. I had learned this from Arthur. In the final years of his life, when his investments began to fail, his gaze had turned cold and calculating whenever he looked at me. It wasn't hatred. It was simply the desperate math of survival. He had started looking at my family's inheritance not as our shared security, but as his personal escape hatch. Now I was seeing the exact same calculation in our son's eyes. I washed the tea mugs by hand, refusing to use the dishwasher. I liked the feel of the warm water, the simple, rhythmic task of cleaning. Once the kitchen was spotless, I walked down the long, dim corridor to the basement door. The door was located under the back staircase, painted the same dull white as the walls to blend in. It had a heavy brass lock, one that Julian had replaced 3 years ago. He had given me a small, plastic-headed key, telling me it was for my safety, so I wouldn't accidentally tumble down the steep wooden steps. He kept the master key on his own ring. I pulled my brass key ring from my pocket. The duplicate key Julian had given me was light and cheap. But nestled behind it was a heavy, solid brass key with a worn, notched edge. I had paid a locksmith in the next town $300 to make it from a clay impression I took while Julian was asleep on the sofa one Sunday afternoon. The lock turned with a deep, satisfying click. The air in the basement was always 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house. It smelled of damp stone, old coal dust, and the vinegar-sharp scent of deteriorating paper. I descended the wooden steps slowly, my hand sliding along the rough-hewn handrail. Julian's private archive was a room at the far end of the cellar, past the old boiler that groaned like a dying beast in the winter. He had installed a modern hollow-core door with a digital keypad. He thought he was being clever, but he had chosen his own son's birthday as the code, 0812. It was the same code he used for his phone, his garage door, and his laptop. Men like Julian are remarkably predictable in their vanity. They believe they are too clever to be searched, so they make no effort to hide. The keypad beeped, and the lock clicked open. Inside, the room was dry and smelled of the dehumidifier hummed in the corner. Julian had set up a sleek glass desk and a leather chair. On the shelves were rows of black binders, organized by year. But I wasn't interested in the binders. I walked over to the corner where a heavy, green-painted iron safe sat on a concrete plinth. This was Arthur's old safe. It had survived 2 world wars and the collapse of 3 banks. Julian had never changed the physical dial combination, likely because he didn't know how, and because he trusted the digital keypad on the door to keep everyone out. I knelt on the cold concrete, my knees aching slightly. I spun the dial, left to 24, right to 12, left to 68. The heavy iron handle gave way with a metallic groan. Inside, resting on the velvet-lined shelf, was my green, leather-bound ledger. I pulled it out, but as I did, my hand brushed against a thick white manila envelope that hadn't been there last week. It was postmarked from a commercial bank downtown, addressed directly to Julian. I hesitated. A lifetime of manners whispered that I should close the safe and walk away. But the memory of Julian's voice in the pantry, discussing my room over the garage, discussing Cedar Crest, silenced that whisper. I opened the envelope. Inside was a loan application for $350,000. It was a secondary mortgage, using this house as collateral. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the pages. The interest rate was predatory, the terms merciless. But it was the signature page that made the blood run cold in my veins. There, on the line marked co-owner/trust beneficiary, was my name, Eleanor Vance. It was written in an elegant, flowing script that looked remarkably like my own. But there was a slight tremor in the curve of the E, a tiny hesitation in the cross of the T that gave it away. Julian had forged it. He had signed my name to a document that would strip the house from the trust and hand it over to the bank if the loan defaulted. And then I saw the date on the cover letter. The bank had approved the preliminary application, but they required a physical, notarized signature on the final deed of trust before the funds could be dispersed. The appointment was scheduled for this Thursday. Thursday, the day the accountant was coming to discuss the property tax assessment. Julian wasn't bringing an accountant to lower our taxes. He was bringing a mobile notary to witness me signing the final documents that would seal my own eviction. He needed me to physically sign the papers, pretending they were simple tax authorizations, because the bank's legal team had flagged the forged signature on the digital application as requiring in-person verification. I sat on the cold basement floor, the papers trembling slightly in my hands. He didn't just want to move me to the garage. He had already risked my home, my security, and his own father's legacy to cover his debts. He was willing to make me homeless, to slide me into a state-run facility once the bank took the house, all to keep his German car and his country club membership. I looked at the forged signature again. A quiet, cold anger, not a raging fire, but the slow, pressurized heat of a coal seam settled deep inside me. I carefully folded the documents, placed them back in the manila envelope, and returned it to the safe exactly as I had found it. I took my green ledger, closed the heavy iron door, and spun the dial. Julian thought he was the architect of this family's future. He had no idea that he was merely a tenant living in a house built on my silence. And now that silence was about to end. The deepest cuts are always made by those we taught how to hold the knife. When Julian was 7, he fell from the old oak tree in the orchard. He broke his arm in 3 places, and his screams filled the valley. I carried him to the car myself, my clothes stained with his sweat and dirt, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stayed awake for 3 days and 3 nights in the hospital corridor, refusing to leave his side, whispering that as long as I was alive, nothing would ever truly hurt him. I had spent his entire life shielding him. When his father's business began to fail, I quietly surrendered my personal jewelry, my grandmother's silver, and my own comfort to ensure Julian never felt the cold draft of poverty. I wanted him to walk through the world with his chin high, untainted by the desperate panic of unpaid bills. In doing so, I had raised a man who believed the world was an endless buffet and that his mother was merely the waitress who kept the plates full. I sat in the worn armchair in my bedroom, the green ledger resting on my lap. The leather was scuffed, the corners softened by decades of my fingers tracing the columns of numbers. This ledger was the true heartbeat of the Vance estate. When my father, Henry Sterling, established the trust in 1974, he was already a cynical man. He had looked at my husband Arthur and seen exactly what Arthur was, a charming man with grand ideas and empty pockets. My father had anchored the house and his entire fortune in a trust so rigid that not even a court order could dismantle it without the sole trustee's consent. And I was the sole trustee. Arthur had spent 30 years trying to find a loophole, a crack in the plaster, a way to bleed the trust dry. He died without ever finding it. Now his son was trying the exact same thing, but with a clumsiness born of modern desperation. I picked up the bedside telephone, a heavy rotary model I refused to replace, and dialed a number I knew by heart. Abernathy and Associates, a polite voice answered. James, please, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Tell him it's Eleanor. A few seconds later, the line clicked, and the dry, rasping voice of James Abernathy came through the receiver. He had been my father's attorney, and now he was mine. He was 82, retired from active practice, but he still kept his fingers on the pulse of the estate. Eleanor, James said, his tone instantly shifting from professional to deeply concerned. It's been a while. Is everything all right at the manor? James, I said, leaning my head back against the chair, Julian has applied for a secondary mortgage on the house, $350,000. He has forged my signature on the preliminary application. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. The only sound was the faint hum of static. He can't do that, Eleanor, James said, his voice dropping an octave. The bank wouldn't approve it without verifying the trust documents. They would see that you are the sole trustee. They flagged it, I explained. That's why he's bringing a notary to the house this Thursday. He told me it's an accountant coming to lower our property taxes. He wants me to sign the final deed under false pretenses. I heard the rustle of papers on James's end, followed by the sharp click of a pen. It's worse than that, Eleanor. If the bank approved a preliminary application with a forged signature, Julian must have provided them with something else to justify why you weren't signing it yourself. A power of attorney or... James paused, and I could hear his labored breathing. Or what, James? I asked. Let me look into this, he said quietly. I still have a contact at that commercial bank. Give me 24 hours. But Eleanor, do not sign anything on Thursday. Not a single scrap of paper. I have no intention of signing, James, I said, but I need to know exactly how deep my son has dug this grave. The next morning, Tuesday, the house was suffocatingly quiet. Julian was sitting at the kitchen island, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him. He hadn't touched his breakfast. He was staring at his phone, his thumb scrolling endlessly, his face pale and drawn. Clara walked in, dressed in her tennis whites. She looked at Julian, then at me, her eyes lingering on my faded apron with a look of mild disgust. "Julian, the landscapers are asking about the spring plantings," she said, her voice sharp. "They need a deposit. I told them to talk to you, but you haven't answered their emails." "I'll handle it, Clara," Julian said, not looking up. His voice was raw, like he hadn't slept. "Well, please do. The lawn is starting to look like a meadow, and Mrs. Gable next door already made a comment about the weeds near the stone wall. It's embarrassing." She grabbed her car keys from the counter, barely glancing at me as she passed. "Mother, if you have time today, could you polish the silver in the dining room? We have the charity board meeting here next month, and it looks terribly tarnished." "I will take care of it, Clara," I said. She left, the back door clicking shut behind her. Julian let out a long, ragged breath. He finally looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot. For a second, just a brief second, I saw the little boy who had fallen from the oak tree. He looked terrified. "Mother," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft, Are you feeling all right lately? You seem a bit forgetful." My heart gave a slow, heavy thud. "Forgetful, Julian?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly even. "In what way?" "Oh, just small things," he said, reaching out to cover my hand with his. His palm was cold and damp. "You forgot to salt the soup last night, and Clara said you misplaced the mail last week. I'm just worried about you. This is a big house, and managing it's a lot of pressure on someone your age." He was laying the groundwork. He was building the narrative of my decline, so that when the bank looked at the forged signature on the preliminary application, he could tell them I was confused, that I had authorized him to sign, that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. "I am fine, Julian," I said, gently pulling my hand away from his grip. "My mind is as clear as it has ever been." He swallowed hard, his smile faltering. Of course it is. I want to make sure you're protected. That's why Thursday is so important. The accountant, he's going to help us restructure some things to make life easier for you." He was looking at me, searching my face for any sign of suspicion. But I had spent 40 years hiding my emotions from a husband who looked for weaknesses like a wolf looks for a limp. Julian was an amateur compared to his father. "I am looking forward to meeting him," I said. Just then my rotary phone in the hallway began to ring. Julian flinched at the sound. I stood up, smoothing my apron, and walked to the hallway. I lifted the heavy black receiver to my ear. "Eleanor?" James Abernathy's voice was no longer calm. It was trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. I found out what Julian submitted to the bank to get that preliminary approval. "Tell me, James," I said, looking through the glass pane of the door toward the kitchen, where Julian was watching me with intense, nervous focus. "He filed a declaration of mental incompetence," James whispered, "and he backed it up with a letter from a Dr. Robert Vance, his cousin. It states that you are suffering from advanced dementia and that Julian has assumed temporary guardianship over your estate." The cruelest lies are not spoken in anger. They are written in quiet rooms by people who call you family. I held the heavy black receiver to my ear, my knuckles turning white against the plastic. Through the doorway, I could see Julian. He had picked up his mug, but his eyes were locked on my face, tracking every twitch of my jaw, every breath I took. "Eleanor, are you there?" James Abernathy's voice was sharp with concern. "Did you hear me?" "I heard you, James," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I forced myself to take a deep, slow breath. How did he justify this? Robert Vance was Arthur's nephew. He was a mediocre man who had barely scraped through medical school, whose struggling private practice had been kept afloat twice by loans Arthur had taken from our joint accounts years ago. He was a gambler, both in life and in business, and it seemed Julian had finally called in those old family debts. "The letter states he has been treating you for cognitive decline for 18 months, James said, his voice cold with professional outrage. He cited episodes of disorientation, memory loss, and an inability to manage financial decisions. "Eleanor, this is criminal. It's medical malpractice, it's conspiracy, and it's bank fraud. We can call the district attorney right now. We can end this today." "No," I said, watching Julian slowly stand up from the kitchen island, his eyes narrowing as he tried to catch my words. "No, James, not yet." "Eleanor, he is trying to take your life away from you," James urged. "If those papers are notarized on Thursday, the bank will disperse the funds directly to Julian's account as your legal guardian. You will lose control of the estate before we can even get a court date." "He won't get those papers notarized, James," I said softly. "But I don't want to just stop him. I want him to see the entire tower he built fall on him. If we go to the police now, he will play the victim. He will say he was acting in my best interest, that he was confused, that Robert made a mistake. I want there to be no doubt." "What do you want to do?" James asked. "I want you to prepare some papers for me," I said, my eyes still fixed on my son. "And I want you to be here on Thursday at 2:00. Bring the true trust documents, the ones my father wrote." "The forfeiture clause," James murmured, the realization dawning in his voice. "You're going to invoke it." "Yes," I said, "every single word of it." My father had been a ruthless businessman, but he had loved me. He knew the greed of the Vance family. In the deep legal prose of the Sterling Trust, he had inserted a clause we called the poison pill. If any beneficiary of the trust, which included Julian after my passing, attempted to legally challenge my competency, interfere with my administration of the trust, or use fraudulent means to access the assets, their interest in the estate would be immediately, permanently, and irrevocably forfeited. By filing that fake dementia letter with the bank, Julian hadn't just committed fraud. He had legally written himself, his wife, and his descendants out of my father's fortune. He had pulled the pin on the grenade and was currently holding it in his hand, thinking it was a golden egg. "I'll have the documents ready, Eleanor," James said. "Be careful. A desperate man is a dangerous one." "Thank you, James." I hung up the receiver. I stood in the hallway for 3 seconds, letting the coldness settle over me like a protective suit of armor. When I walked back into the kitchen, my face was a perfect blank mask of maternal mildness. "Who was that, Mother?" Julian asked, his voice casual, but his eyes scanning mine like a hawk. "Oh, just Mrs. Gable from next door," I said, picking up a dish towel and wiping down the counter. She was complaining about the weeds near the stone wall again. She seems very concerned about the property values. Julian let out a short, sharp laugh, the tension visibly leaving his shoulders. He ran a hand through his hair, his posture slumping back into its usual arrogant ease. "I told you, the old windbag has nothing better to do. Don't worry about her. I'll talk to the landscapers." "Thank you, Julian," I said, looking at him with all the warmth I could muster. "I don't know what I would do without you here to handle these things." "Exactly," he said, turning back to his phone, a smug smile playing on his lips. "That's why we're doing all of this, Mother, to make sure you don't have to worry." I looked down at the counter. To destroy a home, you must first know where the weight-bearing walls are. Julian thought he was the foundation of this house. He had no idea he was just the paint on the walls, and I was about to scrape him off. I spent the rest of the afternoon making phone calls. First, I called my sister Sarah, who lived 2 hours away. I asked her if she would like to take Leo for the weekend, starting Thursday morning. I told her I wanted to do some deep cleaning of the house and didn't want him breathing in the dust. She agreed instantly. She loved Leo and rarely got to see him. Next, I dialed a number I hadn't called in years. "Dr. Vance's office," the receptionist said. "Hello, this is Eleanor Vance," I said, my voice sweet and slightly tremulous. "I would like to speak with Robert, please. Tell him it's his Aunt Eleanor." There was a brief pause, then a muffled conversation on the other end. Robert's voice came on the line, sounding rushed and deeply uncomfortable. "Aunt Eleanor? Is everything all right? I'm right in the middle of seeing patients." "Oh, Robert, I'm so sorry to bother you," I said, letting my voice flutter with a simulated touch of confusion. "But Julian mentioned you were coming over on Thursday with the accountant. I was just thinking, it's been so long since we've had a proper family gathering. Why don't you come for lunch before the meeting? I'm making your favorite, the chicken pot pie." There was a long, suffocating silence. I could almost hear the gears turning in Robert's panicked mind. He was a doctor who had just signed a legal document claiming I was in the advanced stages of cognitive decline. If he accepted a lunch invitation from me, if he sat at my table and ate my food, he would be complicit in a face-to-face deception that no court of law would ever overlook. I don't know, Aunt Eleanor," Robert stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "Thursday is very busy for me. I was just going to stop by briefly for the paperwork." "Oh, but you must," I pleaded softly, the perfect picture of a lonely, doting aunt. "Julian says my memory is getting so bad, Robert. I just want to see you while I still remember who you are." The most dangerous thing about a liar is not their confidence, but their absolute terror of being found out. Robert's voice over the telephone had the thin, brittle quality of dry autumn leaves. I'll try to be there by 1, Aunt Eleanor," he stammered, his professional composure entirely gone. "But please, don't go to any trouble. A simple sandwich is fine." "Nonsense, Robert," I said, my voice dripping with the gentle, stubborn warmth of a grandmother who refused to be argued with. "Family is never a trouble. I'll see you on Thursday." I hung up the phone and stood in the quiet hallway for a moment. By agreeing to come, Robert had sealed his own fate. He was terrified. He wanted to see me, to gauge for himself how demented I actually was, so he could reassure his own conscience before the notary arrived at 2. He wanted to believe his own lie. He wanted to look at me, see a tired, aging woman, and convince himself that he was doing her a mercy by helping her son take her assets. Wednesday arrived with a gray, heavy sky that threatened rain. Clara spent the morning packing Leo's small suitcase. She was in a foul mood, her heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floors as she moved between the laundry room and Leo's bedroom. "I don't understand why Sarah has to take him today," Clara grumbled, throwing a pair of dinosaur-patterned pajamas into the bag. "It's a 2-hour drive, and he has school on Friday. He's going to miss his spelling test." "Sarah was very eager to see him, Clara," I said, folding a small pile of towels nearby. "And with the accountant coming tomorrow to handle the tax assessment, it will be much quieter here. Julian mentioned the paperwork would require a lot of focus." Clara stopped, a pair of Leo's socks in her hand. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes, well, Julian is doing a lot of work to keep this family afloat, Mother. I hope you realize that. This house is a massive drain on our resources. He's stressed out of his mind." "I know he is," I said softly. "I see how hard he works." "Do you?" Clara asked, her voice laced with a cold, condescending pity. "Because sometimes I feel like you think money just appears in the mailbox. Julian has been carrying the weight of this entire estate on his shoulders, while you putter around the garden." I didn't answer. I simply smiled, picked up the folded towels, and walked out of the room. The hardest part of a lie is not telling it. It's remembering who you told what. Clara believed her husband was a wealthy provider who was sacrificing his own peace of mind to keep his aging mother in her historic home. She had no idea that Julian's real estate firm was a hollow shell, that their country club membership was paid for by a quiet monthly transfer from my private account, and that the very clothes on her back were subsidized by the mother-in-law she so deeply despised. I spent the afternoon polishing the silver. I sat at the long mahogany dining table, a soft cloth in one hand and a jar of gray, chemical-smelling polish in the other. I rubbed the silver teapot until the tarnish came away, revealing the bright, mirror-like surface beneath. In the reflection, my own face looked back at me, older, lined with the grief of burying a husband and the quiet sorrow of watching a son rot from the inside out. But my eyes were bright. My eyes were entirely clear. That evening, dinner was a quiet, tense affair. Leo had already left with my sister Sarah. The house felt empty without his small voice, but I was glad he was gone. He was an innocent child, and he did not need to witness the demolition that was scheduled for tomorrow. Julian sat opposite me, picking at his roasted chicken. His phone sat next to his plate, vibrating every few minutes. Each time it buzzed, Julian's shoulders would tense, his eyes darting to the screen before he quickly pressed the side button to silence it. Finally, during the main course, his phone rang with a sustained vibration. Julian scraped his chair back. "Excuse me," he said, his voice tight. "I have to take this. It's the office." He walked out of the dining room, But he didn't go to his study. He walked down the hallway toward the front door, his voice muffled by the thick wood. I quietly stood up from the table. I walked to the edge of the dining room, where the frosted glass panes of the door allowed me to see his silhouette in the hallway. I pressed my ear to the cold wood. "I told you, Robert, she's fine," Julian was whispering hissed, frantic words into the receiver. "She's just old. She's confused. She called you because she's lonely. No, you cannot back out now. The notary is booked for 2:00. The bank has already processed the preliminary approval. If we don't close this tomorrow, the creditors are going to freeze my corporate accounts by Friday." "Yes, I know what the letter said. You signed it, Robert. We're in this together now." There was a pause as Robert spoke on the other end. Julian ran a hand over his face, his shadow pacing back and forth on the rug. "Just play along," Julian hissed. "Eat the damn pie, look professional, and sign the notary book. It's $350,000, Robert. Your cut is $50. That pays off your clinic's back rent. Don't lose your nerve now." He hung up the phone. I heard him take 3 deep, ragged breaths before his footsteps turned back toward the dining room. I quickly and silently slipped back into my chair, picking up my fork just as the door swung open. Julian walked back in, trying to paste a calm, professional smile onto his face. He sat down, but his hands were trembling slightly as he picked up his water glass. "Everything all right at the office, Julian?" I asked, my voice gentle. "Yes, Mother, just a difficult client. Nothing I can't handle." He took a sip of water, then cleared his throat. "By the way, did you call Robert yesterday?" He asked the question with a forced, casual air, but his eyes were drilling into mine, searching for any sign of betrayal. "Robert?" I asked, tilting my head as if trying to recall. "Oh, yes, I think I did. I was feeling so lonely with Leo going to Sarah's, and I wanted to make sure Robert was coming tomorrow. My mind has been so foggy lately, Julian. Sometimes I forget if I've locked the doors or left the oven on." Julian's eyes flared with a sudden, ugly mixture of relief and triumph. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a comforting, manipulative purr. "I know, Mother, I know. It's getting harder for you to keep track of things. That's why I'm here, to take care of the details." "You are such a good son," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "I just wanted to make sure he remembered the safe." Julian froze. His water glass stopped halfway to his mouth. The safe?" "Yes," I said, offering him a sweet, vacant smile. "Your father's old safe in the basement. I went down yesterday to get some preserves, and I noticed the heavy door was unlocked. I must have left it open. But I saw all your folders were safe, even that big white envelope from the commercial bank." Arrogance has a way of blinding a man to the very traps he has set for others. Julian froze. His hand hovered over his water glass, the knuckles white and rigid. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, pale gray under the dining room's dim chandelier. He stared at me, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. The white envelope?" he repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "Mother, you shouldn't be going through my things in the basement. I told you, that room is my office." I offered him a sweet, vacant smile, tilting my head with just the right amount of elderly confusion. "Oh, I wasn't going through your things, dear. The envelope was just sitting on the desk next to the safe. I must have knocked it over when I was looking for the peach preserves. My eyes are so poor these days, I could barely make out the bank's logo. I just wanted to make sure it was put away safely, so you wouldn't lose your important business papers." Julian stared at me for 3 more agonizing seconds, searching my face for any hint of deceit. But I had spent 40 years playing the quiet, obedient wife to a man who would have ruined us much sooner if I hadn't mastered the art of looking harmless. I kept my eyes wide, soft, and slightly out of focus. Slowly, the tension left Julian's shoulders. He let out a long, shaky sigh, a condescending smile returning to his face. He thought I was blind. He thought I was stupid. He believed his own lie so thoroughly that he couldn't imagine a world where his quiet, aging mother was currently holding his entire life in her hands. "Yes," Julian said, his voice returning to its patronizing, smooth tone. "Thank you, Mother. It is indeed very important business. I'll make sure to lock the safe tonight so you don't have to worry about it." "Thank you, Julian," I said, taking a bite of my chicken. "That would be a great comfort." Thursday morning arrived with a cold, relentless rain that beat against the tall sash windows of the manor. The sky was the color of wet slate, casting a dim gray light through the rooms. Julian was pacing the hallways by 8 o'clock, his 3rd cup of coffee in hand. He had dressed in his best charcoal suit, the one he wore for court appearances or high-stakes negotiations. He looked sharp, but the dark circles under his eyes and the constant twitch of his left jaw betrayed the frantic ticking of his internal clock. Clara came downstairs at 11, wearing a cream-colored knit dress and her grandmother's pearls. She looked elegant, but her attitude toward me was as cold as the rain outside. "Mother, is the dining room ready?" she asked, not looking at me as she adjusted her earrings in the hallway mirror. "The accountant will be here soon, and I don't want the house looking cluttered. Julian said this meeting is incredibly important for our tax status." "The dining room is spotless, Clara," I said, smoothing down my dark wool dress. "The silver is polished, and the table is set for lunch." "Lunch?" Clara frowned, turning to look at me. "I thought this was just a quick business meeting. Why are we serving lunch?" "I invited Robert," I said, offering a warm, innocent smile. Since he was coming with the accountant anyway, I thought it would be nice to have a family meal. We see so little of him these days. Clara's face went momentarily blank. Then her eyes darted to Julian, who was standing at the end of the hallway. Julian's expression was a mix of sheer panic and forced calm. He gave Clara a microscopic nod, signaling her to play along. "Oh," Clara said, her voice dropping its sharp edge, replaced by a tight, artificial sweetness. "Right, Robert. Yes, of course. It's always nice to see family." At exactly 12:45, the doorbell rang. Julian practically leaped to answer it. When he opened the door, Robert Vance stood on the porch, holding a dripping black umbrella. He wore a heavy wool overcoat, but he was sweating despite the autumn chill. His face was flushed, his eyes darting nervously around the foyer as he stepped inside. "Robert, dear!" I walked forward, wrapping my arms around him in a warm, maternal hug. I could feel his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was stiff, his arms barely returning the embrace. "Aunt Eleanor," he said, his voice strained and unnaturally high, You look well." "Oh, thank you, Robert. I have my good days and my bad days," I said, stepping back and looking at him with deep, affectionate concern. "But you look so tired, dear. Are you sleeping? Your skin is so pale." "Just busy at the clinic, Aunt Eleanor," Robert said, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. He looked at Julian, a silent, pleading question in his eyes. Julian gave him a firm, warning look, stepping forward to take Robert's coat. "Let's go into the dining room," Julian said, his voice loud and artificially cheerful. "Mother has made a wonderful lunch for us." We sat at the long mahogany table. The polished silver gleamed under the soft light of the chandelier, reflecting our faces. I sat at the head of the table. Julian sat to my right, Clara to my left, and Robert sat opposite Julian, his hands fidgeting with his napkin. I served the chicken pot pie, the rich, buttery scent of the pastry filling the room. For a few minutes, the only sound was the clinking of silverware against porcelain and the steady patter of the rain against the glass. Robert barely touched his food. He kept slicing his pie into tiny pieces, his fork trembling so badly that a piece of carrot fell onto the white tablecloth. "Aunt Eleanor," Robert said suddenly, his voice tight. He cleared his throat, trying to find his professional footing. "Julian mentioned to me that you've been having some lapses lately, forgetting where you put things, feeling a bit disoriented." The room went entirely silent. Clara stopped chewing, her eyes darting between Julian and Robert. Julian sat up straighter, his eyes locked on me, waiting for my reaction. I placed my fork down on my plate with a quiet, deliberate click. I looked at Robert, then at Julian, and finally at Clara. "Oh, we all have our little lapses, Robert," I said, my voice incredibly soft, yet carrying a sudden crystalline clarity that made everyone at the table freeze. "Like how you forgot the Hippocratic oath you took when you became a doctor. Or how Julian forgot that he doesn't actually own this house." The most terrifying sound in the world is the quiet voice of a patient person who has finally run out of patience. The dining room became so silent that I could hear the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of the leaking gutter outside the window. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Clara's fork slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against her porcelain plate. She stared at me, her eyes wide, her perfectly painted lips parted in a silent gasp. Robert looked as if he might faint. The flush on his face vanished, replaced by a ghostly, sweating gray. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly his knuckles turned yellow. He looked at Julian, his eyes pleading for a rescue that wasn't coming. Julian was the first to try and claw his way back to control. He let out a forced, hollow laugh, though the sound died quickly in his throat. He looked at Clara, then at Robert, trying to project the image of a concerned, long-suffering son dealing with a tragic mental breakdown. "You see," Julian said, his voice shaking despite his best efforts, This is exactly what I was warning you about, Robert. The sudden hostility, the paranoia, the delusions. Mother, you're having one of your episodes. You're completely confused. I think you need to go to your room and lie down. We'll have the accountant come back another day." He stood up, intending to physically guide me away from the table, to hide me in the dark before his lies could be stripped bare. "Sit down, Julian," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was the voice I used when he was a child and had crossed a line he could not uncross. It was cold, heavy, and absolutely unyielding. Julian stopped. He hovered over his chair, his body rigid, his face twisted in a mixture of shock and sudden primal fear. Slowly, as if his legs could no longer support his own weight, he sank back into his seat. "Let's talk about the delusions, Robert," I said, turning my gaze to my nephew. "Is it a delusion that on Tuesday Julian applied for a $350,000 secondary mortgage on this property using a forged signature under my name?" Robert swallowed, a dry, clicking sound in his throat. "Aunt Eleanor, I don't know anything about a mortgage." "And is it a delusion," I continued, ignoring his weak protest, "that you signed a legal medical declaration on your professional letterhead stating that I have been under your care for 18 months for advanced cognitive decline? A letter that was submitted to the commercial bank to justify why Julian was signing the preliminary documents as my temporary guardian." "Julian!" Clara's voice suddenly pierced the room, sharp and panicked. She turned on her husband, her eyes wild. "Julian, what is she talking about? Forged signatures? A guardianship? You told me this was a standard tax restructuring. You said she wanted you to take over the administrative work because she was tired." "Clara, shut up," Julian hissed, his professional facade finally cracking. He didn't look at his wife. He kept his eyes locked on me, his breathing ragged. "I did what I had to do," Julian suddenly snarled, slamming both palms down on the polished mahogany table. The silver teacups rattled. "Do you have any idea what kind of pressure I've been under? The firm is drowning, Clara. We are weeks away from losing everything. The cars, the school, the club, everything. I did this to save us, to keep this house." He turned his fury back to me, his face red, a vein pulsing violently in his forehead. "And you sit here in this massive, empty house, doing nothing, contributing nothing, while I break my back trying to keep the roof over our heads. You think you're so clever, Mother? If I don't get this loan by Friday, the bank is going to freeze my corporate accounts. We will be bankrupt. This house will be seized. Do you want to be thrown out on the street?" I looked at my son. I felt no anger, only a deep, hollow pity for the small, greedy man he had become. "The bank cannot seize this house, Julian," I said softly. "Of course they can!" he screamed, his spit landing on the white tablecloth. "The mortgage is in default. I haven't paid the county taxes in 18 months. They will foreclose, you foolish old woman." "No, Julian, they won't," I said, leaning back in my chair. "They won't, because the mortgage is not in default. The mortgage was paid off in full 3 years ago. By me." Julian stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. "What? That's impossible. I've been making the payments." "You've been transferring money into a joint account that you thought went to the bank," I explained, my voice steady and calm. "But I bought the note from the bank 3 years ago through the Sterling Trust. Your mortgage payments have actually been going directly into my private account. The county taxes have been paid every year on time, by James Abernathy on behalf of the trust. You bought the mortgage?" Julian whispered, his voice suddenly losing all its volume. He looked as if the gravity in the room had suddenly doubled. "The Sterling Trust holds the absolute, unencumbered title to this house, Julian," I said. "And as the sole trustee, I am the only person who can authorize a loan against it. Your forged documents are completely worthless. The bank was never going to disperse the funds to you. They were waiting for today." Right then, the heavy grandfather clock in the hallway began to chime. 1, 2. As the second chime echoed through the quiet house, the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, clear sound that shattered the remaining tension in the room. "That will be James Abernathy," I said, standing up from the table and smoothing my dark wool dress. "And the mobile notary you requested, Julian. I think it's time we do some proper signing." The hardest thing for a proud man to accept is that he was never the master of the house, only the guest. I walked down the long, quiet hallway to the front door, the heels of my shoes making a steady, soft clicking sound on the polished oak. Behind me, the dining room remained frozen in its panicked silence. I turned the heavy brass knob and pulled the door open. James Abernathy stood on the porch, his long wool overcoat damp from the wind. He was carrying a thick brown leather briefcase with brass clasps that had been scuffed by years of use. Beside him was a younger woman dressed in a sharp navy blue suit. She held a black leather folder close to her chest, her eyes darting nervously toward the interior of the house. "Eleanor," James said, stepping inside and taking off his hat, "this is Ms. Carter. She is the mobile notary requested by the commercial bank." "Welcome, Miss Carter," I said, offering her a warm, polite smile. "Thank you for coming in such dreadful weather. Please, come into the dining room." Miss Carter looked slightly uncomfortable, sensing the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the house, but she nodded politely and followed us down the hall. When we entered the dining room, the scene was devastatingly clear. Julian had slumped back into his chair, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, staring at the polished mahogany table as if it were a mirror showing him his own ruin. Clara sat rigid, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the damp overcoat of the attorney. Robert Vance looked like a man awaiting a firing squad. He had pushed his plate away, his breathing shallow and rapid. James Abernathy did not hesitate. He walked to the far end of the table, placed his leather briefcase down, and popped the brass clasps. The sound was like 2 pistol shots in the quiet room. He pulled out a thick stack of documents, bound in blue legal backing, and laid them flat on the mahogany surface. "Julian," James said, his voice carrying the dry, merciless authority of a man who had spent 50 years in courtrooms. "Robert, let's not waste anyone's time. We are here to resolve a matter of systemic fraud." "James," Julian muttered, not looking up, "this is a family matter. We don't need you here." "Actually, Julian, you do," James said calmly, putting on his reading glasses. "Because if I were not here, the county sheriff's department would be. The bank's fraud division was alerted yesterday afternoon when I submitted the True Trust Registry, showing that Eleanor Vance is the sole trustee and beneficiary of the Sterling Trust, and that she has never authorized any power of attorney or guardianship to you." Robert let out a soft, whimpering sound. "Julian, you said the bank was already handled." "Shut up, Robert," Julian hissed, but the anger had lost its teeth. It was the desperate lash of a cornered animal. James Abernathy pulled a document from the stack and slid it across the polished table. It stopped directly in front of Robert. "Robert," James said, "this is a formal rescission of the medical declaration you signed. It states, under penalty of perjury, that your previous letter regarding Eleanor Vance's cognitive capacity was a clerical error and was submitted without clinical foundation. If you sign it, and Ms. Carter here notarizes it, I will withhold filing the formal criminal complaint with the State Medical Board until tomorrow morning. That will give you exactly 18 hours to retain legal counsel before they suspend your license." Robert's hand trembled as he reached for the document. He looked at Julian, but Julian was staring blankly at the wall, completely ignoring him. "I'll sign," Robert whispered, tears of panic finally welling in his eyes. "I'll sign it right now." "Excellent," James said, passing a pen to Ms. Carter, who stepped forward with a solemn, professional expression. She opened her notary ledger, stamped the document, and guided Robert's shaking hand to the signature line. Once Robert had signed, James slid another set of documents across the table. These stopped in front of Julian. "Now, Julian," James said, his voice dropping to a cold, flat register, "this is your formal acknowledgement of forfeiture." Julian finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and full of venom. "Forfeiture? Of what? This is my father's house. I am his heir." "You were his heir, Julian," James corrected him, tapping the blue paper with his finger. "But your grandfather, Henry Sterling, was a very wise man. When he drafted the Sterling Trust, he included a very specific clause. Clause 9, forfeiture for bad faith interference. It states that if any conditional beneficiary attempts to challenge the competency of the trustee or attempts to access the trust's assets through fraudulent or legal maneuvers, their interest in the estate is immediately and permanently extinguished." Julian stared at the document, his breathing stopping entirely. "My share of the trust?" "It's gone, Julian," James said softly. "The moment you submitted that forged preliminary application to the bank, you legally wrote yourself, your wife, and your children out of the Sterling estate. You have no legal claim to this house, no claim to the trust capital, and no right to remain on this property." Clara let out a strangled cry, her hand flying to her pearls. "Julian, no, no, this can't be true. The trust is worth millions. You told me we were the sole heirs." "He lied to you, Clara," I said from the head of the table. My voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "Just as he lied to the bank, and just as he lied to me." Julian stood up slowly, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and desperation. He glared at me, his fists clenched. "You can't do this. I have a copy of the deed. My father put my name on the title after he died." James Abernathy smiled faintly, a dry, humorless expression. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out one final document. "Your father did indeed try to transfer the title to you in his will, Julian," James said. "But your father didn't own the house. The Sterling Trust owned the house. And we have the ledger of your company's transactions from the joint household account. James opened the folder, revealing a sheet of paper with columns of red numbers, including the $200,000 you quietly siphoned from your mother's personal accounts over the last 4 years to cover your firm's bad investments. We spend our lives building walls to keep the world out, never realizing that the most dangerous enemies are already sitting at our table. Clara stared at Julian, her face contorting with a sudden, vicious realization. The elegant, polished woman who had sneered at my garden weeds and demanded I polish the silver vanished in an instant. In her place was a terrified, furious stranger. $200,000? Clara's voice rose to a shrill, cracked register. You stole $200,000 from your mother's personal accounts while you were telling me we were doing fine? While you were leasing that new Mercedes? While you were telling me we had to keep up appearances for the club? Clara, shut up, Julian yelled, his hands flying to his face. I was going to pay it back. It was a bridge loan for the Riverview development. Once the closing happened, I was going to put every single dollar back into her account. There is no Riverview development, Julian, James Abernathy said quietly, sliding a thin gray folder toward him. The city denied the zoning permits 3 months ago. Your firm has been insolvent since January. You've been using your mother's life savings to pay the interest on your corporate loans just to keep the bank from foreclosing on your offices. Julian let out a choked, ragged sound, his head dropping into his hands. His shoulders shook, and for a moment the room was filled with the pathetic sound of his muffled weeping. It was the same cry he had made when he broke his arm at 7 years old. But this time, I felt no urge to hold him. I felt no desire to stay awake for days to keep him safe. The boy who had fallen from the tree had grown into a parasite who had spent years quietly draining my life's blood while pretending he was the one keeping me alive. Mother, Julian whispered, looking up at me through red, tear-filled eyes. He reached his hand across the table, his fingers outstretched, desperate for the unconditional grace he had assumed would always be there. Mother, please, I'm your son, your only boy. You can't do this to me. You can't throw us out. What will people say? What about Leo? Do you want your grandson to grow up with his father in prison? He was weaponizing my grandson. Even now, in the absolute ashes of his defeat, he was looking for a shield to hold in front of himself. Leo is safe, Julian, I said, my voice as cold and clear as ice. He is with Sarah, and he will stay with Sarah until you and Clara have found a suitable, realistic place to live, a place you can actually afford. And where is that? Clara spat, turning her venom on me. We have nothing. Julian's firm is bankrupt. If we leave this house, we have nowhere to go. You're going to make your own family homeless because of some legal technicality? It is not a technicality, Clara, I said, looking at her. It is the law. And as for where you will go, that is no longer my concern. You have 48 hours to pack your personal belongings. James has prepared the voluntary surrender agreement. If you sign it and you are gone by Saturday at noon, I will not file the criminal charges for the $200,000 Julian stole from my accounts. If you are not gone, the sheriff's department will execute an eviction, and the district attorney's office will receive the complete file." Julian looked at the papers. He looked at the heavy brass keyring resting on the table next to my hand. He realized, with a terrible, absolute finality, that the door had closed. The quiet, obedient ghost of a mother who had washed his clothes and tolerated his contempt for 7 years had vanished. Slowly, the tears stopped. Julian's face hardened, the pathetic pleading turning into a cold, ugly mask of bitter hatred. He sat up, wiping his face with his sleeve, and let out a short, mocking laugh. "You think you've won, Mother?" he whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can just sweep us out like dust and live here alone in your perfect, quiet house? You think you've saved yourself?" "I have saved this house, Julian," I said. "Have you?" Julian sneered, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing. "You forgot one very important detail, Mother. I knew the bank was flagging the mortgage. I knew I was running out of time. So 3 weeks ago, I signed a private sale agreement with an estate liquidation company. I sold the entire contents of this house to cover my immediate corporate debt. The portraits, the sterling silver, the antique library, the grandfather clock. Everything. I've already spent the non-refundable deposit." He smiled, a twisted, ugly expression that showed his teeth. "They're coming tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock with a moving truck, Mother. And the contract I signed gave them legal permission to clear out every single room. Try stopping them without a police report that puts your only son in federal prison." Desperate men always believe they can burn the family archives to keep themselves warm, never realizing the smoke will eventually choke them. Julian's smug, ugly smile lingered on his lips. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest, waiting for the panic to set in. He expected me to gasp, to plead, to offer him a compromise, to save my mother's silver and my father's portrait from the back of a liquidator's truck. Beside him, Clara's posture straightened, a faint, desperate hope flickering in her eyes. They thought they had found the one thread that, if pulled, would unravel my entire defense. I looked at my son. Then I turned my head slightly and looked at James Abernathy. James did not look panicked. In fact, he looked almost pitying. He slowly reached into his breast pocket, pulled out his linen handkerchief, and polished his reading glasses with meticulous care before placing them back on his nose. "Harrison and Sons liquidation, I assume?" James asked, his voice entirely devoid of concern. Julian's smile faltered just a fraction. "How did you—" "Julian," James sighed, shaking his head. "Mr. Harrison has been the Sterling family's preferred appraiser for 40 years. When you approached him 3 weeks ago with a bill of sale for the manor's entire inventory, he was naturally quite interested. But he is also a professional. He knows this house belongs to the Sterling Trust, and he knows I am the firm's legal representative." James pulled a folded piece of paper from his briefcase and slid it across the table. "I spoke with Thomas Harrison this morning at 9 o'clock, James continued. When I showed him the true trust documents and informed him that you had no legal title to any asset inside this house, he was, understandably, quite horrified. He has already canceled the moving trucks. The contract you signed is legally void ab initio, void from the beginning, because you cannot sell what you do not own. Furthermore, his legal team is currently drafting a civil complaint against you for the immediate return of his $75,000 deposit, plus damages for fraud. Julian's face went from pale to a terrifying mottled purple. He stared at the letter from Harrison and Sons, his hands beginning to shake so violently that the table vibrated. Every single escape route, every clever maneuver, every desperate lie he had constructed had been quietly, systematically dismantled before he had even walked into the room. He had built a house of cards, and we had simply opened the window. You planned this," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and pure, unfiltered hatred. You knew everything, and you just sat there. You let me do it." "I let you make your own choices, Julian," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "And you chose to betray me. You chose to forge my name. You chose to claim I was losing my mind, all so you could keep living a life you couldn't afford. I didn't set these traps for you. You built them yourself. I simply stopped stepping into them." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Robert Vance stood up slowly. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at the floor, his face completely hollow. "I'm going," he whispered. I have to call my lawyer." "That would be wise, Robert," James Abernathy said. Robert walked out of the dining room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway until the heavy front door clicked shut behind him. Ms. Carter, the notary, quietly gathered her stamps and ledgers, gave me a polite, sympathetic nod, and followed James's assistant out of the house. Only James, Julian, Clara, and I remained. James pushed the voluntary surrender agreement toward Julian. "Sign the papers, Julian. Sign them, pack your things, and leave this house. Let's end this with whatever dignity you have left." Julian stared at the blue legal document for a long, agonizing minute. His pen hovered over the signature line. Clara sat next to him, her head in her hands, weeping silently. She had realized the truth. The luxury, the status, the proud Vance name she had married into was nothing but a hollow shell, and it had just collapsed into dust. With a trembling hand, Julian signed his name. He threw the pen onto the table, stood up, and looked down at me. "We're leaving," he hissed, his voice cold and sharp as glass. "But don't think you've won, Mother. This house is a tomb. You're going to sit here all alone in the dark, with nothing but your polished silver and your memories until you rot. And when you finally do die, there won't be anyone here to find you." He turned and stormed out of the room, Clara following closely behind him, her heels clicking frantically on the hardwood. A few minutes later, I heard their footsteps on the stairs, heavy and hurried, as they went to pack their lives into cardboard boxes. James Abernathy quietly packed his documents back into his leather briefcase and snapped the brass clasps shut. He looked at me, his old eyes filled with a deep, quiet sadness. "Are you going to be all right, Eleanor?" he asked softly. "I am fine, James," I said, offering him a faint, tired smile. For the first time in 7 years, I can breathe. "You have 48 hours of storm to weather," he warned, standing up. "Desperate people do desperate things when they are packing." "I know," I said, "but the keys are in my pocket, James. They always have been." After James left, I sat alone at the long mahogany table for a long time. The rain continued to fall, a steady gray curtain outside the windows. The chicken pot pie had gone completely cold, the pastry stiff and pale. Suddenly, from the floorboards beneath my feet, I heard a strange, rhythmic clicking sound coming from the basement. It wasn't the radiator. It was a fast, frantic sound, the sound of someone tearing through the metal shelves of the safe. Julian had signed the papers, but he hadn't left yet, and he had one final desperate card to play. When a man realizes he cannot own the future, he will often try to steal the past, hoping its weight will somehow anchor him. I descended the basement stairs slowly, my hand sliding along the rough, damp wood of the banister. The air grew colder with each step, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of the old boiler and the vinegar-sharp tang of ancient paperwork. The rhythmic clicking sound from the archive room grew louder, accompanied by the frantic rustle of paper being torn from folders. The door to Julian's private archive was wide open. The bright, sterile LED light he had installed cast harsh shadows across the concrete floor. Julian was on his knees in front of the green iron safe. He had dragged out dozens of manila folders, spilling their contents across the floor. He was frantically tearing through the papers, his fingers smudged with dust and ink. In his hand, he held a heavy, brass-bound wooden box, Arthur's personal locked box, which had sat on the top shelf of the safe for 7 years, untouched. He had forced the lock with a flathead screwdriver, the splintered mahogany lying on the floor like dead leaves. I stood in the doorway, my shadow stretching across the concrete until it reached his knees. "There is no money in that box, Julian," I said softly. He flinched, his head snapping up. His hair was disheveled, his charcoal suit jacket discarded on the floor, and his tie loosened. He looked wild, desperate, and entirely undone. "You think I'm looking for money?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. He held up a thick stack of faded yellow papers. "I was looking for the original trust registry. I thought if I could find a loophole, a grandfather clause, anything." He let out a dry, hacking laugh that sounded like a cough. He dropped the papers back into the box, but as he did, his hand brushed against a small, velvet-lined compartment at the bottom. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy, cream-colored stationery. It was a letter written in Arthur's distinctive, elegant cursive, the sweeping, dramatic script he had used for everything from business deals to love letters. Julian's laughter died. He stared at the letter, his eyes tracking the handwriting. "What is this?" he muttered, looking up at me. "It's addressed to you. It's dated 2 weeks before Father died." My heart gave a slow, heavy thud. I had forgotten about that letter. Or rather, I had chosen not to think about it for 7 years. I knew exactly what was written on those pages, and I knew the damage it would do if Julian ever read it. "Julian," I said, taking a step forward, my hand outstretched, "give me the letter. It's private." "No," he said, scrambling backward on his knees, his eyes locked on the page. "No. If Father wrote this to you right before he died, it belongs to the estate. It belongs to me." He unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. "Julian, please," I said, my voice dropping to a low, warning register. "Some truths are better left in the dark. You've lost enough today. Don't do this to yourself." But he wasn't listening. He began to read, his eyes moving rapidly across the lines. I stood silent, watching the transition on my son's face. It was a terrible thing to witness. The desperation and anger slowly drained out of him, replaced by a deep, hollow shock that made his skin turn a translucent, sickly white. The letter was Arthur's confession. But it wasn't a confession of financial ruin. Arthur had written to me in the final weeks of his illness, when the cancer had metastasized and his mind was clear of the desperate greed that had consumed his life. He had discovered that Julian, who was then 31 and working as a junior partner in Arthur's firm, had been quietly forging Arthur's signature on corporate checks to pay off personal gambling debts in the city. Arthur had chosen to hide the theft, quietly liquidating his own life insurance policies to cover Julian's tracks, which was the real reason the family business had collapsed so spectacularly after his death. He had died in debt not because of bad luck, but because he had sacrificed his own reputation to save his son from a prison sentence. But the final paragraph of the letter was the one that broke Julian. Julian's voice was barely a whisper as his eyes scanned the cursive script. He read the words aloud, his voice cracking like dry wood. "He has his grandfather's ambition, Eleanor, but none of his honor. He is a thief, and he will always be a thief. Do not let him near the Sterling Trust. If you give him access to the foundation, he will tear the house down around your ears, and he will watch you starve to death in the ruins. Protect yourself from our son, Eleanor. He does not love you. He only loves what you can give him." The paper slipped from Julian's fingers, drifting slowly through the cold air before landing on the dusty concrete floor between us. He sat there on his knees, his arms hanging limp at his sides. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, hollow, and entirely empty of the arrogance that had defined his adult life. The myth he had built for himself, the belief that he was the golden child, the savior of the Vance family, the proud successor of a brilliant father, had been utterly, permanently destroyed. He realized that his father had died knowing exactly what he was. He realized that for 7 years I had washed his clothes, cooked his meals, and tolerated his arrogance while holding the proof of his absolute betrayal in my hands. "Did you know?" Julian whispered, his voice trembling so hard he could barely form the words. Did you always know he wrote this?" The most painful mirrors are not the ones that show our physical age, but the ones that show us who we truly are in the eyes of the people we tried so desperately to impress. I looked down at Julian, his shadow trembling against the damp stone of the cellar floor. The yellowed paper of his father's letter lay between us like a physical boundary. "Yes, Julian," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper, yet holding the heavy weight of 7 years of silence. "I've known since the day your father died." "And you never said a word," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the concrete. "You let me sit at your table. You let me tell you how to run this house. You let me think I was the one saving you." I kept the secret because I loved you, I said softly, and because your father, despite everything, wanted you to have a chance. He didn't want you to go to prison. He wanted his memory to be clean for you, so you would have something honorable to look up to. I kept that letter hidden because I hoped, I prayed, that if you believed your father was a great, honorable man, you would try to be like him. I wanted to give you the space to prove him wrong, Julian. I took a slow step closer, my hand resting on the cold iron door of the safe. But you didn't prove him wrong, I continued, the sadness in my chest finally hollowed out. Every choice you made over the last 7 years proved him entirely right. You treated this house like an asset to be bled. You treated me like an inconvenience to be managed. You forged my name to save yourself, just as you forged his. Julian didn't answer. He didn't look up. The silence of absolute defeat is a terrible, quiet thing. He slowly gathered his discarded suit jacket from the floor, his movements slow and heavy, like those of an old man. He didn't touch the letter. He left it lying on the concrete. He stood up, his posture slumped, and walked past me without a word, his shoulder brushing mine as he slipped out into the dim basement corridor. I heard his slow, heavy footsteps climbing the stairs, one by one, until the kitchen door clicked shut above. I knelt on the cold floor, my knees aching. I picked up Arthur's letter, carefully folded it along the old, worn creases, and placed it in my apron pocket. Then I closed the heavy door of the iron safe, spun the dial, and locked the wooden door of the archive. The house was incredibly quiet that night. From my bedroom on the first floor, I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of packing from the upper corridor, the tear of packing tape, the heavy slide of cardboard boxes, the quiet, muffled murmur of Julian and Clara's voices. There was no shouting, no anger. The storm had passed, leaving behind only the cold, mechanical reality of packing up a life that had been built on a foundation of sand. Friday morning arrived with a pale, watery sun that did little to warm the cold stone walls of the manor. At 10 o'clock I was in the kitchen, making a pot of tea. The back door opened, and Clara walked in. She was dressed in a simple wool sweater and dark trousers, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. The pearls were gone. The expensive makeup was gone. She looked tired, her eyes red and swollen. She stood near the counter, her arms crossed over her chest, watching me pour the hot water into the teapot. "We've packed the master bedroom and Leo's room," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the sharp, condescending edge she had used for years. "Julian's truck is coming tomorrow morning to take the boxes to a rental unit downtown." "Thank you, Clara," I said. "I appreciate you keeping to the schedule." Clara let out a short, dry sound that was half laugh, half sigh. "You've destroyed him, Eleanor. I hope you know that. Whatever he did, he's your son. You've completely broken him." I placed the teapot down and looked at her, my gaze steady. "I didn't break him, Clara. I simply stopped pretending he was whole. Julian broke himself years ago, and he expected me to pay the bill for his repairs forever." "He's not sleeping," Clara whispered, her arms tightening around herself as if she were cold. She looked toward the hallway, her eyes filling with a sudden, genuine fear.
He's been sitting in the dark up there all night, staring at the floor. He hasn't touched his food. He hasn't spoken a word to me since yesterday."
She took a step closer to the counter, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "Eleanor, I'm scared," she said, her eyes wide. "He keeps looking at his father's old hunting rifle, the one Arthur kept in the library cabinet. He has the key, Eleanor. He won't let me near the room, and he keeps repeating that he has nothing left to lose." The final, most desperate weapon of a defeated man is to hold his own life hostage, demanding that you sacrifice your truth to pay his ransom. I stood in the kitchen, the warmth of the teapot rising between Clara and me. She was trembling, her hand clutching her wool sweater so tightly the fabric groaned. Her eyes were wide, wet, and absolutely terrified. She was waiting for me to scream, to drop the teapot, to run down the hallway in a panic and fling myself at the library door, begging Julian to put the gun down. She was waiting for me to play the role of the desperate mother, ready to surrender the trust, the house, and my own soul to save her son. But I knew Julian. I knew the blood that ran in his veins. Julian was Arthur's son, and Arthur, for all his grand gestures and loud threats, was fundamentally a coward. He was a man who used fear as a currency because he had no actual strength of his own. Julian's threat of the rifle wasn't a desperate bid for death. It was a desperate bid for leverage. He had realized that his lies, his forgeries, and his financial manipulations could no longer force me to submit. So he was holding his own life hostage, hoping the sheer terror of maternal guilt would make me unlock the safe and tear up the eviction papers. "Where is the key to the gun cabinet, Clara?" I asked, my voice flat, cold, and entirely steady. Clara blinked, taken aback by my calm. I don't know. He had it on his key ring, the small silver one with the brass tag." "Go upstairs, Clara," I said, placing the teapot down on the counter. "Get your coat, pack Leo's remaining toys, and wait in the car. Do not come down until I call you." "Eleanor, you can't go in there alone," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He's unstable. He's been drinking." "Go to the car, Clara," I repeated, my voice carrying that same quiet, unyielding authority. She stared at me for a second, then turned and fled up the stairs, her frantic footsteps receding into the upper floors. I walked down the long, dim hallway toward the library. The house felt incredibly cold, the air thick with the smell of old paper and the damp, earthy scent of the rain that had finally stopped, leaving the gardens outside sodden and silent. The library door was made of heavy, solid mahogany, carved with intricate panels that Arthur had imported from Spain. I stood before it for 3 seconds, listening. There was no sound from within, no weeping, no frantic movement, only a heavy, dead silence. I didn't knock. I reached out, turned the heavy brass knob, and pushed the door open. The library was dark, the heavy velvet drapes drawn tight against the morning sun. The only light came from the hallway behind me, casting a long, narrow beam across the Persian rug. The air smelled of stale whiskey, dust, and old leather. Julian was sitting in Arthur's high-backed leather armchair, the very chair his father had died in 7 years ago. He had his sleeves rolled up, his collar open. On the small table beside him sat an empty bottle of scotch and a single glass, sticky with amber residue. Resting across his knees was the hunting rifle, a vintage polished Winchester with an engraved stock that Arthur had used for deer hunting in the northern woods. Julian was holding a soft flannel cleaning rag, slowly, methodically, rubbing the barrel of the gun. He didn't look up when I entered. He kept his eyes fixed on the metal, his hand moving in slow, rhythmic circles. "You didn't run," Julian said, his voice low, raspy, and thick with alcohol. "Clara ran. She screamed. But you just walked in." "I am your mother, Julian," I said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind me, shutting out the light. We were left in the heavy amber gloom of the curtained room. I know the sound of a bluff. Julian's hand stopped. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot, dark circles carving deep hollows into his face. He looked at me with a terrifying, hollow intensity. "You think this is a bluff?" he whispered, his fingers sliding down to the trigger guard. "You think I won't do it? I have nothing left, Mother. You've taken my firm, my reputation, my father's legacy, and my home. By tomorrow at noon, I'll be on the street, and by Monday, the police will be at my door. You've stripped me of everything. Why should I stay?" "Because you are too vain to die, Julian," I said, walking slowly toward the desk. I didn't approach him. I sat in the small wooden chair opposite the armchair, my hands resting calmly on my lap. "And because you want me to beg. You want me to tell you that the money doesn't matter, that the house is yours, that I'm sorry. You want to see me on my knees." Julian let out a ragged, dry sob, his shoulders shaking. He lifted the rifle, the heavy barrel catching the dim light, and pressed the cold steel of the muzzle directly under his chin. "Say the word, Eleanor," he hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying, unstable energy. "Tell me you don't care. Tell me you want me gone. Tell me you'd rather have this empty stone tomb than your own son. Say it, and I'll pull the trigger." I looked at my son. My chest ached with a deep physical pain. The phantom weight of the baby I had held in my arms, the boy I had protected, the man I had hoped would save us. But I also saw the monster his greed had created. If I broke now, if I fell to my knees and gave him the trust, he would destroy us both anyway. He would bleed the estate dry, and we would end up in the dark anyway. "I care, Julian," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and entirely devoid of the panic he was starving for. "I care more than you will ever know, but I will not let you use your life as currency to buy back your lies. If you pull that trigger, you are not punishing me. You are simply finishing the destruction your father warned me about. The choice is yours, but the safe remains locked." Julian stared at me, his finger tensing on the metal trigger. The silence in the room became so heavy I could hear the slow, rhythmic ticking of the small brass clock on the mantelpiece. Tick, tick, tick. With a sudden, violent movement, Julian pulled the rifle away from his chin, but he didn't put it down. He slid the bolt back with a loud, metallic clack. He looked at me, a single bitter tear cutting a clean line through the dust on his cheek. "It was never about the money, Mother," he whispered, his voice dropping to a chilling, quiet register. "I wanted you to look at me the way you looked at him, but you never did. so I'm going to make sure you never forget me." He slammed the bolt forward, chambering around, and pointed the rifle directly at my chest. The ultimate tragedy of a spoiled child is that when they are denied the world, they would rather destroy the person who gave it to them than learn how to walk on their own. The dark, heavy barrel of the Winchester pointed directly at my chest. In the dim amber gloom of the library, the muzzle looked like a deep black eye, staring at me with a cold, unblinking intent. Julian's hand was shaking, the metal of the gun vibrating slightly, but his finger was hook tight around the curved trigger. I did not move. I did not gasp. I sat in the wooden chair, my hands resting quietly on my lap, my breathing slow and even. "You really aren't afraid," Julian whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of awe and resentment. "You think I'm too weak to do it. You think I'm a coward, just like Father." "Your father was a complicated man, Julian," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, conversational tone that seemed to grate on his raw nerves. But he was meticulous about gun safety. He never, under any circumstances, kept ammunition in the gun cabinet. He kept it in the small green iron drawer inside the basement safe. The safe you forced open yesterday only contained his letters. The keys to the ammunition drawer are currently on my keyring in my pocket. Julian's eyes widened, a sudden frantic panic darting through his bloodshot pupils. He looked down at the rifle, then back at me. You're bluffing," he stammered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I found a box of shells in his desk drawer. I loaded it, Mother. I loaded 3 rounds. "Those were decorative dummies, Julian," I said softly, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. I knew Arthur had kept a few copper-plated dummy rounds in his desk for display. They have no powder. They have no primers. The gun is empty. "No!" Julian screamed, a wild animal sound of pure frustration. "No! You're lying! You're trying to trick me!" He clenched his eyes shut and pulled the trigger. Click. The dry, hollow sound of the firing pin hitting an empty chamber echoed through the dark library like a cruel, metallic joke. Julian opened his eyes. He stared at the rifle, then pulled the bolt back again and pulled the trigger a second time. Click. The absolute crushing humiliation of that silent sound seemed to deflate him instantly. The manic, alcohol-fueled rage vanished, leaving behind only the broken, pathetic shell of a 40-year-old man who had tried to play the monster and failed. The rifle slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor before rolling onto the Persian rug. Julian fell back into his father's leather chair, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking as he let out a long, ragged sob. It was a pathetic, empty sound, the weeping of a child who had realized his final, most terrifying tantrum had changed nothing. I stood up slowly, my knees stiff from the cold. I walked over, picked up the heavy Winchester from the floor, and held it by the stock. It was cold and heavy in my hands. "The truck will be here tomorrow morning at 8, Julian," I said, looking down at my weeping son. "Make sure you are packed. I want this room empty by Saturday at noon." I turned and walked out of the library, closing the heavy mahogany door behind me. leaving him alone in the dark with his empty bottle and his empty gun. I spent the rest of Friday in my garden. The rain had stopped, leaving the earth damp, sweet, and fertile. I knelt in the soil, digging up the spent summer annuals, preparing the beds for the winter frost. It was quiet, peaceful work. Upstairs, the sounds of packing continued, the muffled thud of boxes and the tearing of tape, a distant, harmless hum. Clara stayed out of my way, and Julian did not leave the library until nightfall, when I heard him quietly drag himself up the stairs to bed. Saturday morning arrived with a bright, crisp autumn sun that turned the yellowing leaves of the oak trees into a canopy of gold. By 10 o'clock, the moving truck had arrived. 2 young men in gray uniforms began carrying the cardboard boxes from the upper corridor down to the driveway. Clara was red-eyed and silent, directing them with quiet, defeated gestures. Julian was helping them, his movements mechanical, his face entirely blank. He didn't look at me once. He moved like a ghost through the corridors of the house he had tried to steal, carrying the pieces of his life in cardboard boxes. By 11:30, only 30 minutes remained before the deadline. The moving truck was fully loaded, its heavy steel doors slammed shut with a resounding bang. Julian's German sedan was parked behind it, the trunk packed to the brim with Clara's suitcases. I sat in the kitchen, a fresh cup of tea in front of me, watching them through the window. The house was starting to feel lighter, as if the heavy, suffocating layer of their deceit was being peeled away, room by room. Suddenly, a loud, crunching sound of gravel echoed from the driveway. It wasn't the moving truck leaving. A sleek, black sedan had pulled in, blocking Julian's car. 2 men dressed in dark, sharp suits stepped out of the vehicle. They didn't look like movers. They carried leather folders, and their faces were grim and professional. Julian stopped in the driveway, a box of Leo's remaining books in his hands. He stared at the 2 men, his face draining of what little color it had left. One of the men reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a small leather wallet, and flipped it open, revealing a gold badge that caught the autumn sun. Through the window, I watched my son drop the box of books, the colorful covers spilling across the gravel like dead leaves. We spend our lives running from the consequences of our choices, never realizing that justice is a patient hunter that always knows where we are planning to hide. I stood up from the kitchen table, leaving my tea to cool in the porcelain mug. I pushed open the heavy oak back door and stepped out onto the porch. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The yellow leaves of the oak tree drifted slowly down, landing on the hood of the black sedan that had blocked the driveway. Julian was frozen. He stood next to his car, his hands half raised, the cardboard box of Leo's books lying ruptured on the gravel at his feet. A colorful picture book about a little red tractor lay face up in the dirt. Clara was standing near the moving truck, her hands pressed to her cheeks, her eyes wide with a sudden, suffocating panic. The 2 men in dark suits stepped forward. One was a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair at his temples. The other was younger, carrying a heavy leather folder. The older man pulled a gold badge from his breast pocket, holding it flat for Julian to see. "Julian Vance?" the older man asked, his voice low, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion. "Yes," Julian whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustle of the leaves. Who are you?" I am Detective Miller with the State Financial Crimes Unit, the man said. This is Investigator Davis. We have a warrant for your arrest. No! Clara screamed, rushing forward, her heels crunching violently on the gravel. No, you can't! This is a mistake! My husband hasn't done anything wrong. We're just moving. Detective Miller didn't look at Clara. He kept his eyes locked on Julian. Julian Vance, you are being placed under arrest for grand larceny, commercial bank fraud, and elder financial exploitation. Mother! Julian suddenly screamed, turning his face toward the porch where I stood. His eyes were wide with a desperate, childish terror, his face pale and sweating. Mother, you promised. We signed the agreement. You said if I signed the voluntary surrender and left the house, you wouldn't file the charges. You gave me 48 hours. He thought I had betrayed him. Even now, in the absolute shadow of his ruin, he believed I was the architect of his pain. I walked down the wooden steps of the porch, my shoes making a soft, steady sound on the gravel. I stopped 10 feet away from him, my hands folded in front of my wool dress. I kept my promise, Julian, I said softly, my voice carrying a quiet, heavy sadness. I never called the police. I never submitted the file James prepared. Then why are they here? Julian wept, his shoulders shaking as Investigator Davis stepped behind him, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt.
Why are they doing this? Because the bank is a corporation, Julian, Detective Miller explained, his voice calm and firm. They don't make family agreements. When Mr. Abernathy flagged the preliminary loan application as a forgery on Thursday, the bank's security division was legally required to report it to the state attorney's office. And your cousin, Dr. Robert Vance, turned himself into the police yesterday morning to avoid a conspiracy charge. He gave us everything. The steel handcuffs clicked shut around Julian's wrists. Click, click. It was the same sound the empty Winchester had made yesterday in the dark library. But this time, the chamber wasn't empty. This click was real, heavy, and permanent. Julian let out a broken, high-pitched sob as Investigator Davis guided his hands behind his back. The box of Leo's books lay forgotten on the ground, the little red tractor book slowly getting damp from the morning dew. Clara watched her husband being led toward the black sedan. She didn't try to stop them. She stood paralyzed, her face twisted in a mixture of horror and absolute disgust. She realized that the husband she had defended, the successful businessman she had bragged about to her country club friends, was being loaded into the back of a police car in front of the entire neighborhood. Once the sedan's door clicked shut, leaving Julian's pale, weeping face visible behind the tinted glass, Clara slowly turned to look at me. The panic in her eyes had vanished, replaced by a cold, toxic venom that made her jaw tighten. She walked toward me, her heels digging deep into the gravel, until she was standing just inches away. "You think you've won, Eleanor," she hissed, her voice a low, vibrating whisper of pure hatred. "You think you've saved your precious stone tomb, but you've destroyed my husband. You've put Leo's father in prison, and I swear to you, as long as I have breath in my body, you will never see that boy again. I will make sure he forgets your face. I'd rather he grow up in a state home than ever hear your name." She was weaponizing my grandson again. It was her final, desperate strike, the only venomous barb she had left. I looked at Clara. I didn't flinch.
I reached into the pocket of my wool dress and pulled out a small, folded white document bearing the seal of the county family court. "Leo is safe, Clara," I said, my voice quiet and steady, "and he is not going to a state home. My sister Sarah filed for temporary emergency guardianship yesterday afternoon. The court approved it this morning, citing Julian's arrest warrant and your lack of stable housing." Clara stared at the document, her mouth opening and closing silently. You took my son," she whispered, her voice losing all its venom, replaced by a cold, hollow terror. "No, Clara," I said, tucking the paper back into my pocket. "You and Julian abandoned him the moment you decided to build your life on a lie. I simply made sure he had a home to come back to." Sometimes the quietest victories are the most devastating, because they leave you standing alone in a house that is finally quiet, but completely empty. Clara stared at me, the white document from the family court trembling in her hand. The rage in her eyes didn't just fade, it evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollow vacuum. She looked down at the paper, then back up at the grand stone facade of the manor, and finally toward the empty driveway where the police car had vanished minutes ago. She had no cards left to play. No husband, no money, no home. And now her hold on her own son was slipping away into the legal hands of a sister-in-law she had spent 7 years ignoring. Without a word, Clara turned. She walked to Julian's German sedan, her movements stiff and mechanical. She got into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and started the engine. The tires spun on the wet gravel, throwing up a small cloud of dust and stones as she tore out of the driveway, the moving truck lumbering slowly behind her. Then the silence returned. It was a different kind of silence than the one I had lived with for 7 years. It wasn't the tense, suffocating quiet of unspoken lies and simmering resentment. It was the vast, clean silence of a winter morning after a heavy snowfall. I stood in the driveway for a long time, the cool autumn wind rustling the leaves of the oak tree. I knelt on the damp gravel and slowly picked up the books Julian had dropped. I gathered the colorful picture book about the little red tractor, wiping the dirt and dew from its laminated cover with my sleeve. I held them close to my chest and walked back into the house. The interior of the manor felt hollow. The rooms where Julian and Clara had lived were stripped bare, the walls showing pale squares where their expensive leased paintings had once hung. The air was cool, carrying only the faint scent of cardboard, packing tape, and floor wax. I walked up the grand staircase to Leo's room. It was completely empty. The bright blue curtains were gone, the bed was dismantled, and the shelves were bare, save for a single green crayon that had rolled into the corner of the closet. I picked up the crayon, placed it in my apron pocket next to Arthur's letter and the family court document, and laid the stack of books on the empty windowsill. I would make sure his books were waiting for him when he came to visit. I walked down the hallway to the master suite, the room Julian and Clara had occupied, the south wing they had planned to relegate me to the garage to free up. It, too, was empty. But as I walked past the built-in mahogany desk in the corner, I noticed the bottom drawer was slightly ajar. Julian had been in a hurry. I pulled the drawer open. Inside was a pile of discarded receipts, empty envelopes, and a small leather-bound desk calendar. I reached in to clear the trash,
but my fingers brushed against a false back at the rear of the drawer. My husband Arthur had been fond of secret compartments, and it seemed Julian had inherited his father's taste for hidden spaces. I pressed the small wooden catch, and the panel popped forward. Inside was a slim, navy blue leather folder. I pulled it out, opening it under the pale light of the window. My breath caught in my throat. Inside was Julian's passport, and tucked neatly behind the photo page was a single one-way airline ticket from our local international airport to Zurich, Switzerland. The date on the ticket was tomorrow, Sunday morning at 6:15. I sat down on the edge of the empty built-in window seat, the ticket trembling slightly in my hands. Julian had never intended to use the $350,000 from the secondary mortgage to save the firm or keep the family afloat. He had never intended to pay off the bank or the county taxes. He was going to run. He had planned to let me sign the papers on Thursday, receive the wire transfer into his personal corporate account on Friday, and board a plane on Sunday morning, leaving Clara, Leo, and me to face the bank's foreclosure, the creditors, and the absolute ruin of his debt alone. He was going to abandon his wife and his 8-year-old son without a single dollar, leaving them to be evicted from a house he had already stolen. He was going to leave us in the dark while he started a new life in Europe with a forged fortune. I stared at the blue ticket, the sheer, breathtaking depth of my son's narcissism finally revealing itself in its entirety. He wasn't just a thief. He was a traitor to his own blood. By stopping the loan on Thursday, I hadn't just saved my father's house. I had unknowingly saved Clara and Leo from abandonment so cruel it would have shattered them completely. The telephone in the hallway began to ring, its shrill mechanical chime echoing loudly through the empty, hollow corridors of the house. I stood up, placing the airline ticket in my pocket, and walked down the stairs. I lifted the heavy black receiver to my ear. "Eleanor?" James Abernathy's voice was quiet, grave, and entirely serious. "I'm calling from the office. I just received a message from the state attorney's representative." "Yes, James," I said, my voice steady. "They arrested Julian in the driveway an hour ago." "I know," James said, pausing. "But there's a complication, Eleanor. When they searched Julian's office downtown yesterday afternoon, they found something else. Something Julian kept in his corporate safe. It's not just bank fraud, Eleanor. He had a co-conspirator, someone inside your own family trust." We look for enemies outside our walls, forgetting that the people who helped us build the fence are the ones who know exactly how to climb over it. I held the heavy black receiver to my ear, my knuckles turning white. The silence in the hollow kitchen was so deep that James Abernathy's voice sounded incredibly sharp, like dry twigs snapping in the cold. "A co-conspirator, James?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Who?" "Your brother, Eleanor," James said, his voice dropping to a low, painful register. "Richard." The name felt like a cold stone dropping into the pit of my stomach. Richard, my younger brother. When our father, Henry Sterling, had drafted the trust in 1974, he had looked at Richard's gambling debts, his failed business ventures, and his unstable lifestyle, and he had done what any ruthless patriarch would do.
He had cut him out. Henry had left Richard a small, conditional monthly stipend, but the absolute control of the Sterling Trust, the capital and the manor, had been left entirely to me. I had spent 40 years feeling guilty about that. For 40 years, I had quietly supplemented Richard's stipend with my own money, sending him checks for his birthdays, paying for his medical bills, and making sure his rent was paid whenever his investments fell through. I had treated him like a fragile, unfortunate boy who had simply been born without our father's business mind. I never realized that his fragile helplessness was merely the mask he wore to hide a lifetime of bitter, burning resentment. "How, James?" I asked, leaning against the cold kitchen counter. "How was Richard involved?" Julian's corporate safe contained a series of private contracts, James explained, the rustle of papers audible over the line. Richard was the one who gave Julian the confidential copy of the Sterling Trust deed. He was the one who pointed out the succession clause. Julian didn't know about the poison pill clause on his own. Richard did. I closed my eyes, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place with a terrible, crystalline clarity. "The succession clause," I murmured. "Yes," James said. "Under the terms of the trust, if you were to be declared mentally incompetent, the administration of the trust wouldn't automatically go to Julian. It would fall to the designated successor trustee. And because your father drafted the document in 1974, before Julian was even born, the named successor trustee is Richard." I let out a slow, ragged breath. Richard and Julian had been partners. Richard had guided Julian's hand, helping him draft the fake dementia letter and secure the predatory bank loan. They had planned to declare me incompetent, install Richard as the successor trustee, and then Richard would authorize the $350,000 loan to Julian. Once the funds were dispersed, Richard was going to receive a 50% cut of the estate's capital, and Julian would take the rest and flee to Switzerland. My own brother had used my own son to try and steal the inheritance our father had denied him 40 years ago. "They were going to split it, Eleanor," James said, his voice heavy with a deep professional sorrow. "Richard signed the corporate guarantees for Julian's loans, using his own future stipend as collateral. Now that Julian has been arrested and the fraud has been exposed, the bank is going to freeze Richard's accounts as well. He is completely ruined." "I see," I said. "Eleanor, listen to me," James said, his tone suddenly turning sharp and urgent. "Richard knows Julian has been arrested. He knows the state investigators have his signed contracts from the corporate safe. He has nothing left to lose. My office received a call from his landlord downtown 20 minutes ago. Richard left his apartment in a state of panic, and he was driving toward the manor." My hand tightened on the receiver. "He's coming here." "Yes," James urged. "Do not open the door, Eleanor. I am calling the sheriff's department right now, but they are 15 minutes away. Lock the doors and stay in your room." "Thank you, James," I said softly. I hung up the receiver. I stood in the quiet hallway, the grandfather clock ticking slowly behind me. Tick, tick, tick. I didn't run to my room. I didn't lock the heavy oak front door. Instead, I walked to the kitchen, took 2 porcelain cups from the cabinet, and placed them on the table. I set the kettle on the stove and turned on the flame. If my brother was coming to finish the destruction of my family, I wanted him to find me sitting at the table, entirely ready. Suddenly, the loud crunching sound of gravel echoed from the driveway outside. It wasn't the slow, heavy rumble of the moving truck or the professional hum of the police sedan. It was the frantic, screeching halt of an old, rusted station wagon, the car I had helped Richard buy 3 years ago. The engine died with a wet, sputtering cough. I stood in the kitchen, watching the blue flame of the stove flicker under the copper kettle. Outside, the heavy footsteps of a desperate man began to climb the wooden steps of the porch. The heavy brass knocker on the front door clanged 3 times, the sound vibrating through the empty, hollow rooms of the manor like a summons. Envy that is nurtured in silence for 40 years does not fade with age. It simply hardens into a cold, sharp stone that waits for the right moment to be thrown. I walked down the hallway and opened the heavy oak front door. Richard stood on the porch, his chest heaving, his thin gray hair plastered to his forehead by the damp wind. At 70, he looked like a hollow caricature of our father. He had the same high cheekbones and sharp nose, but none of the cold, commanding strength. His wool coat was unbuttoned, his collar crooked, and his eyes were wild, darting frantically around the empty foyer before locking onto mine. He looked like a man who had been running for 40 years and had finally hit a brick wall. "Eleanor," he gasped, his voice thin and cracking. We have to talk. I need to come in." "Come into the kitchen, Richard," I said, my voice quiet and entirely steady. "The kettle is on." I turned and walked back down the hallway, not waiting to see if he followed. I heard his heavy, uneven footsteps behind me, the soles of his shoes dragging on the polished oak. When we entered the kitchen, the kettle was just beginning to let out a low, soft whistle. I poured the steaming water into the 2 porcelain cups I had set on the table, the scent of chamomile rising into the cool air. Richard didn't sit down. He stood near the kitchen island, his hands shaking so violently he had to shove them into his coat pockets to hide it. He stared at the 2 cups, then at me, his face twisting in a mixture of rage and desperate panic. "You knew," he whispered, his jaw tightening. "Julian, they arrested him. The state investigators. They have my contracts, Eleanor. They have my name on the bank documents." "I know, Richard," I said, taking my seat at the table. I wrapped my hands around the warm porcelain of my cup, drawing comfort from the heat. "James told me everything." "James is a parasite," Richard suddenly snarled, slamming his fist down on the counter. The impact rattled the tea tin. "He always was. He helped Father cut me out of my own birthright, and now he's helping you destroy me." "You destroyed yourself, Richard," I said softly, looking up at him. 40 years ago, our father saw exactly who you were. He knew you would bleed the family dry if he gave you control. I didn't want to believe him. For 40 years, I sent you money, I paid your debts, I tried to keep you afloat because I loved you. I thought I was protecting my brother. "Your checks!" Richard spat, his voice rising to a shrill, cracked register of pure, ancient resentment. "You think those checks were an act of love, Eleanor? They were an insult. Every single month, $100 here, $500 there, a beggar's allowance. You wanted me to beg. You wanted me to look at you as the savior, the saint of the family. while you sat in this palace playing the master of the sterling fortune. You kept me on a leash." I looked at my brother, my heart breaking for the sheer, wasted depth of his bitterness. "Your charity was the heaviest chain of all, Eleanor," he whispered, his eyes filling with a cold, watery hatred. "Every time I had to call you to ask for help with my rent, I wanted to burn this house to the ground. I was his son. I was the male heir. I should have had this house. I should have had the trust." "So you used my son to try and take it," I said. "Julian was easy," Richard sneered, a cruel, mocking smile showing his teeth. "He was greedy, stupid, and desperate. I told him how to get around the succession clauses. I was going to be the trustee, Eleanor. Once you were locked away in Cedar Crest, I was finally going to have what Father should have given me. I was going to dismantle this house, stone by stone, and sell every single inch of the land." He took a step closer to the table, his face pale and sweating. He leaned forward, his hands pressing against the polished wood. "But you stopped the loan," he hissed. "You ruined everything. And now the investigators are freezing my accounts. I have no money, Eleanor. I have no way to pay my lawyers. I need the cash from the basement safe." "The safe is locked, Richard," I said. "I know you keep the physical gold coins and the bearer bonds in there," he pleaded, his voice dropping to a frantic, unstable whisper. "Give them to me. It's over $100,000. I can get across the border before they freeze my passport on Monday. Give me the key, Eleanor. I am your brother. You can't let me go to prison." "No, Richard," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "I will not give you a single dollar of my father's money to help you run from your choices. And you aren't going to the border." I paused, looking toward the window. "James called the sheriff's department 15 minutes ago, Richard," I said softly. "They are already on their way." Richard froze. His face went from pale to a terrifying, translucent white. In the quiet autumn air outside, a distant, faint wail began to echo through the trees. It was the sound of a siren, rising and falling, growing louder with every passing second. Richard's eyes flared with a sudden, wild madness. He reached into his deep coat pocket, but he didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a heavy metal canister of lighter fluid and a silver lighter, the one Arthur had given him for his 50th birthday. "If I can't have this house, Eleanor, neither can you," Richard whispered, his voice shaking with a terrifying, permanent madness. 40 years of waiting. I'd rather see this place in ashes than let you sit here alone." He flipped the lighter open. The small yellow flame danced in the dim kitchen, reflecting in his wild, desperate eyes. A desperate man believes that by burning the house, he can erase the memory of his own failure, never realizing that the ashes will only form a monument to his ruin. Richard's hand was shaking so violently that a few drops of the clear, pungent lighter fluid splashed onto the polished mahogany of the kitchen island, the sweet chemical smell instantly cutting through the warm aroma of the chamomile tea. He held the silver lighter close to the wood, the small yellow flame dancing, casting long, frantic shadows across his pale, sweating face. "Richard," I said. My voice was very quiet. I didn't stand up. I didn't reach for the canister. I sat in my wooden chair, my hands still wrapped around my warm porcelain cup. I looked at my brother, not with anger and not with fear, but with a deep, crushing sorrow that had been 40 years in the making. "Do you remember the summer of 1958, Richard?" I asked softly. He flinched, the lighter flame flickering. He stared at me, his mouth opening slightly, his eyes wild and confused. What are you talking about?" "The summer the old barn caught fire," I said, my gaze steady. "You were 9. You had been playing with matches behind the hayloft, and the whole structure went up in less than 10 minutes. Do you remember what Father did?" Richard's jaw tightened, a sudden, painful memory flitting through his eyes. He swallowed, his throat making a dry, clicking sound. He whipped me in front of the landscapers. He told me I was a brainless fool who would destroy everything he built. "Yes," I said, "he did. And do you remember what I did after he went inside?" Richard stared at me, the lighter still hovering over the mahogany. The distant wail of the sirens was much louder now, the sharp, rhythmic screech echoing from the bottom of our long gravel driveway. You brought me a bowl of ice," Richard whispered, his voice suddenly losing its frantic, manic edge, replaced by a child's raw, broken vulnerability. "And you told me the barn didn't matter, that it was just wood." "It was just wood, Richard," I said, leaning forward slightly. "And this house is just stone. If you light that fluid, you will only ruin the cabinets, and you will choke on the smoke long before the granite walls ever catch fire. But more importantly, you will prove our father right. You will prove that you are exactly what he said you were, a man who destroys things because he doesn't know how to build them." The small yellow flame of the lighter trembled. Outside, the red and blue lights of the sheriff's sedans began to flash through the tall kitchen windows, painting the white plaster walls with a frantic, rhythmic glare. The tires of 3 cars crunched violently on the gravel, followed by the sharp, metallic slam of car doors. "Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a gentle whisper, "let the lighter go. Let's not let him win today." My brother stared at me. He looked at the flashing red lights on the kitchen wall, then down at the small flame in his hand. The manic, desperate energy that had sustained him for 40 years seemed to drain out of his body all at once, leaving behind only a tired, fragile, 70-year-old man who was utterly, completely exhausted. Slowly, his thumb slid off the metal wheel. The flame went out, plunging the kitchen back into the dim, gray light of the autumn afternoon. He dropped the silver lighter onto the table. It rolled a few inches, clicking against his untouched teacup before stopping. He sank into the wooden chair opposite me, his face buried in his hands, his thin shoulders shaking as he let out a low, silent weep. The back door was pushed open with a firm, heavy thud. "Sheriff's Department," a loud, commanding voice called out. "Eleanor Vance?" "I am in the kitchen," I called back, my voice calm and steady. 2 deputies dressed in brown uniforms stepped into the room, their hands resting on their utility belts. They looked at the canister of lighter fluid on the island, then at Richard, who was weeping silently into his hands, his gray hair disheveled. "Are you all right, Mrs. Vance?" the older deputy asked, his eyes scanning the room. "I am fine," I said, offering him a tired, polite smile. "My brother is ready to go now. Please, be gentle with him." The deputy nodded. He stepped forward, gently but firmly, guiding Richard's hands behind his back. The metal handcuffs clicked shut with a quiet, heavy sound that seemed to seal the end of 40 years of resentment. Richard didn't look at me as they led him out of the kitchen. He kept his head down, his eyes fixed on the slate floor, his steps slow and heavy. The back door clicked shut behind them. I sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time. The red and blue lights continued to flash through the windows for a few minutes, then faded as the sedans slowly backed down the gravel driveway, their sirens silent now. The kitchen smelled faintly of chamomile, old wood, and the sharp chemical tang of the spilled lighter fluid. I picked up my porcelain cup. The tea had gone completely cold, but I took a sip anyway, the bitter, cool liquid sliding down my throat. The house was finally, completely quiet. The heaviest thing a mother can carry is the absolute silence of a house she had to empty just to keep it from falling down. The evening fell slowly over the manor, bringing with it a deep slate-gray dusk that softened the sharp lines of the stone walls. The rain did not return, but the wind remained, whispering through the bare branches of the oak tree and rattling the tall sash windows of the dining room. I spent the twilight hours cleaning. I took a soft cotton cloth and a tin of lavender wax, and I slowly, methodically wiped the spilled lighter fluid from the kitchen island. I rubbed the wood until the sweet petroleum scent vanished, replaced by the clean, familiar fragrance of oil and herbs. I washed the 2 unused teacups by hand, drying them with a linen towel and returning them to their shelf in the pantry. Once the kitchen was spotless, I walked through the rest of the house, turning off the lights one by one. In the north wing, the empty rooms echoed with the hollow sound of my footsteps. There were no cardboard boxes left, no frantic packing tape, and no hushed, angry whispers. The master suite was nothing but a series of pale, clean squares on the walls and the dusty outline of a bed that had been carried away. I stood in Leo's empty bedroom for a long time, looking out at the dark silhouette of the orchard. I reached into my apron pocket, my fingers brushing against the small green crayon I had found in his closet. I took it out and placed it on the windowsill next to the stack of picture books I had gathered from the driveway. Tomorrow, I would drive my station wagon to Sarah's house. I would sit on the porch, watch Leo play in the grass, and read him the story of the little red tractor. He would have a home to return to because I had chosen to stand my ground. He would grow up knowing the truth of who he was, protected from the hollow, desperate greed that had consumed his father and his grandfather. But tonight, the house belonged only to the silence. I walked down the grand staircase, my hand sliding along the cool mahogany handrail. I entered the library, where the drapes were still drawn tight against the night. I walked over to the desk, pulled out the drawer with the secret panel, and placed Julian's passport and the one-way airline ticket to Zurich inside. I pressed the panel closed, locked the drawer, and slid the key onto my brass ring. The man who had pointed an empty gun at my chest was currently sitting in a concrete cell, waiting for a bail hearing that no one would pay for. My brother, who had held a flame to my father's wood, was sitting in a ward downtown, his mind finally collapsing under the weight of 40 years of resentment. Clara was gone, chasing the remnants of a lifestyle that had never actually existed. I had saved the foundation. I had protected the inheritance. I had quietly removed the invisible pillars holding their lies together, and I had watched the entire structure fall exactly where it belonged. But as I walked back into the kitchen, the absolute cold reality of my victory settled over me like a heavy winter coat. I sat in my usual chair at the head of the long mahogany table. The dining room was dark, save for the pale silver moonlight that filtered through the sash windows, illuminating the polished wood. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked slowly, the steady rhythmic sound the only heartbeat left in the massive stone manor. Tick, tick, tick. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the solid brass key ring. The keys were cool, heavy, and polished by decades of my fingers. I laid them flat on the dark wood of the table. They caught the moonlight, shining like small, silent silver coins. I had spent my entire life folding laundry, cooking meals, hiding secrets, and managing crises for men who treated me like a ghost inside my own home. I had sacrificed my youth, my dreams, and my own peace of mind to keep their world from falling apart. And now the keys were mine. The house was mine. The silence was mine. I leaned my head back against the high wooden chair, my eyes closing as the cold, clear quiet of the empty manor wrapped around me. I had saved the home, but as I sat alone in the dark, I realized that the hardest part of keeping a foundation safe is knowing that you are the only one left to stand on it. The clock chimed once for the half hour, the metallic sound vibrating through the empty corridor before dying away into the dark. I sat in the kitchen, and for the first time in 40 years, I did not have to look at the time. A few months later, when the biting winds of winter finally gave way to the first warm touch of spring, this ancient stone manor truly began to heal. The scent of lavender and fresh wood polish had completely replaced the damp chemical smell of old secrets and cheap gasoline. I stepped out onto the porch, looking at the bright green shoots rising from the rose beds I had tended with my own hands. The world outside continued its frantic rush, but inside this ridgetop property, the storm had finally stopped at the gate. Julian was serving his sentence. In his quiet cell, he now had plenty of time to contemplate the true weight of the signatures he had once forged so casually. Clara had moved into a modest apartment in the suburbs, working a retail job to support herself, learning for the first time in her life the actual value of $1 earned by her own hands. Richard, my unfortunate brother, was now settled in a monitored care facility, his mind finally resting as the 40 years of envy faded into the quiet fog of old age. They had once treated me like a ghost, an unpaid tenant to be swept away to make room for their shallow ambitions. But they had forgotten one fundamental truth. The ghost was the only one who knew where the foundation lay. "Grandma, look what I drew!" Leo's bright, clear voice echoed from the kitchen table. He was holding the green crayon, the one I had found in the corner of his empty closet months ago, and was carefully drawing a large stone house with a thick canopy of oak trees surrounding it. Sarah brought Leo to stay with me every weekend. Watching his innocent smile, seeing the morning light catch the soft down of his hair, I knew that every cold calculation, every silent choice I had made, had been worth it. I had saved this child from the cycle of greed that had ruined his father and grandfather. I walked into the kitchen, placing 2 cups on the table, a warm chamomile tea for myself and a glass of warm milk for Leo. On the polished mahogany surface, the heavy brass key ring lay quiet in the sunlight. The keys were no longer a symbol of confinement, nor were they a burden of secrets I had to carry alone. Today they were the quiet proof of my absolute freedom. I sat down next to my grandson, gently smoothing his hair. The house was no longer empty. It was full of the simple, honest sounds of a child's laughter, the aroma of fresh tea, and the deep, uncomplicated peace of a home where the truth was finally spoken. People so often mistake a mother's patience for weakness, her silence for stupidity. But sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding the structure together, not through anger or loud declarations, but through the patient strength to let the greedy destroy themselves. I looked out the window where the ancient oak trees were whispering in the spring breeze. The house stood strong, permanent, and quiet. I had spent my entire life cleaning up the ruins left behind by the men of this family, but today, in this bright, quiet room, I finally knew the truth. A home is only as strong as the hands that hold the keys.